Everyone warned her not to ask questions, but no one warned her that the loneliest child in New York was waiting behind a locked door. Claire Bennett tightened her grip on the leather strap of her overnight bag as the black SUV rolled through towering wrought iron gates that seemed tall enough to hide an entirely different world. Beyond them stretched a quiet estate unlike anything she had ever imagined. The mansion stood at the end of a winding driveway lined with century-old oak trees, their branches casting long afternoon shadows across perfectly trimmed lawns. Everything about the property whispered wealth, discipline, and silence. Even the fountains seemed to flow more quietly than they should. Claire had worked as a nanny for families in Boston, Connecticut, and Manhattan, but nothing compared to this place. It didn't feel like a home. It felt like a fortress pretending to be one. She glanced down at the employment folder resting on her lap. The contract had been unusually brief. Excellent salary, private residence, full-time live-in position, 1 child, strict confidentiality, no photographs, no visitors, no questions regarding the employer's business. She had nearly declined until she saw the number printed beside the annual salary. It was enough to erase her student loans, help her widowed mother replace the leaking roof back home in Vermont, and finally allow her younger brother to finish community college without taking a second job. Sometimes life didn't offer perfect choices. Sometimes it only offered necessary ones. The SUV stopped beneath an elegant stone entrance where a middle-aged woman in a navy suit waited with hands folded neatly in front of her. "Miss Bennett," she greeted warmly, though her smile never quite reached her eyes. "Welcome. I'm Mrs. Eleanor Graves, head of household." Claire thanked her and stepped onto the polished stone walkway. The air smelled faintly of cedar and freshly cut grass. Somewhere in the distance, a wind chime rang softly before falling silent again. Inside, the mansion felt even larger than it appeared from outside. Marble floors reflected warm afternoon light pouring through enormous windows. Crystal chandeliers sparkled overhead. Every painting looked as though it belonged in a museum. Yet despite the luxury, something was missing. There were no family photographs on the walls. No scattered toys. No laughter drifting through hallways. It was beautiful in the same way an empty church could be beautiful. Mrs. Graves led Claire through endless corridors before finally stopping outside a cozy bedroom prepared for her arrival. Fresh flowers sat beside the window. Her suitcase had somehow already been delivered. "Dinner is served promptly at 6, Mrs. Graves explained calmly. "Breakfast begins at 7. The child follows a structured routine." Claire nodded. "I'd love to meet him whenever he's comfortable." Mrs. Graves hesitated for the first time. "His name is Ethan, 6 years old." Another pause lingered in the room. "He has had several caregivers." Claire smiled gently. "Children need consistency. I'm patient." Mrs. Graves looked toward the hallway before lowering her voice. 17 nannies have accepted this position during the past 12 months. Claire blinked. 17. None stayed. The answer landed heavier than she expected. Was Ethan that difficult? Mrs. Graves slowly shook her head. "No." Claire waited for an explanation that never came. Instead, Mrs. Graves offered only 3 simple rules. Never enter the West Wing unless instructed. Never interrupt Mr. Moretti when he is home. And if you hear something you don't understand, trust that there are reasons. Before Claire could ask another question, Mrs. Graves quietly excused herself, leaving the bedroom door slightly open behind her. The mansion returned to complete silence. Claire unpacked a few sweaters, placed a framed photo of her family on the bedside table, and took a slow breath. She reminded herself why she had accepted this job. Children weren't problems to solve. They were hearts waiting to feel safe. Just as she reached for her notebook, a faint sound drifted through the stillness. It wasn't loud. It wasn't angry. It was the unmistakable sound of a little boy crying somewhere beyond the long hallway, behind a single closed door. Claire remained perfectly still, listening as the soft crying echoed once again through the quiet mansion. It was not the loud, angry cry of a child throwing a tantrum. It was smaller than that, almost as though someone had learned to cry without expecting anyone to come. She looked toward the hallway, remembering Mrs. Graves' careful instructions only minutes earlier. Never enter the West Wing unless instructed. The words lingered in her mind, but another sound followed. A frightened little gasp. Then silence. Claire set down the sweater she had been folding and stepped into the hallway. The mansion seemed even larger now, every polished floor reflecting the warm glow of antique wall sconces. She followed the faint sound carefully, her footsteps barely making a noise against the thick runner carpet. The farther she walked, the quieter everything became. She passed elegant portraits, closed library doors, and a grand staircase before reaching a hallway that felt strangely untouched by the warmth of the rest of the estate. At the very end stood a white wooden door, different from every other dark mahogany door in the mansion. It was the only one with tiny fingerprints near the handle. Claire stopped several feet away. She knew she should turn around. This was her first afternoon. She had promised herself she would earn trust before bending any rules. Then another quiet sob reached her ears. Her heart made the decision before her mind could argue. She knocked gently. "Ethan? My name is Claire. I am your new nanny." No answer came, only silence. She waited several seconds before trying again. "You do not have to open the door. I just wanted you to know you are not alone." Still nothing. Claire noticed the door was slightly unlatched. She slowly pushed it open only a few inches. The room inside was unexpectedly beautiful. Sunlight spilled across shelves filled with books, puzzles, toy trains, and carefully arranged stuffed animals. A telescope stood beside the large window overlooking the gardens. Everything was perfectly organized except for one corner where blankets had been piled into a small hiding place. Curled inside that blanket nest sat a little boy with dark curly hair, hugging his knees tightly against his chest. His small shoulders trembled as he stared at the floor. Claire stayed near the doorway instead of walking closer. "I like your telescope," she said softly after a long moment. "Did you ever find the moon during the day?" Ethan did not answer. He did not even look at her. Claire noticed a book lying upside down near the blanket fort. It was a picture guide to constellations. "When I was little," she continued quietly, "my grandfather used to tell me that every star had a story. I believed him for years." The little boy's fingers tightened around the blanket. It was the first movement she had seen. Claire slowly sat down on the floor several feet away, careful to leave plenty of space between them. She crossed her legs and simply waited. She did not ask questions. She did not tell him to stop crying. She only shared the silence with him. Nearly a full minute passed before Ethan cautiously lifted his eyes. They were deep brown, thoughtful beyond his years, and filled with exhaustion no child should carry. Their eyes met for only a second before he looked away again, but Claire smiled anyway. "That is okay," she whispered. "We do not have to talk today." She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small folded paper square she had absent-mindedly made during the drive. With slow, careful movements, she unfolded and refolded it until it became a tiny paper crane. She placed it gently on the floor between them before sliding it only a few inches forward. Ethan stared at the little bird. For the first time, his breathing began to slow. He reached out cautiously, picked up the crane with both hands, and studied it in complete silence. Claire felt herself smile. It was only a paper bird, but somehow it had crossed a distance that words could not. Then a deep voice, calm yet unmistakably commanding, spoke from the open doorway behind her. "Who gave you permission to enter this room?" Claire slowly turned toward the doorway without standing up. Framed by the warm light of the hallway stood the man every employee seemed careful never to mention for longer than necessary. Adrian Moretti filled the entrance without making a single dramatic movement. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and powerfully built beneath a perfectly tailored charcoal shirt with the sleeves rolled neatly to his forearms. A dark tattoo disappeared beneath the open collar near his neck, contrasting against his brown skin. His expression revealed almost nothing, yet the room itself seemed to grow quieter simply because he had entered it. Claire understood immediately why people lowered their voices around him. It was not fear born from shouting. It was respect shaped by certainty. He looked first at the open door, then at Claire sitting on the floor, and finally at the small paper crane resting in Ethan's hands. "I asked you a question," Adrian said evenly. Claire rose slowly, careful not to make any sudden movement that might disturb Ethan. "No one gave me permission, sir," she answered honestly. "I heard him crying." Adrian's dark eyes remained fixed on her. "You were instructed not to enter this hallway." "Yes. Yet you ignored that instruction on your first day." Claire nodded. "I did." Silence settled between them. She could feel the weight of Mrs. Graves' warnings echoing in her memory, but she refused to invent excuses that were not true. "I believed Ethan needed someone more than I needed to follow a rule," she said quietly. Adrian studied her face as though searching for hesitation. Instead, he found only sincerity. "Do you often decide which rules deserve your attention?" His voice remained calm, almost conversational, but every word carried unmistakable authority. Claire chose her next sentence carefully. "Only when a child believes no one is coming." Adrian glanced toward his son. Ethan had not hidden beneath the blankets again. Instead, he continued holding the small paper crane with surprising care, gently running one finger along its folded wings. It was a tiny detail, almost invisible, but Mrs. Graves suddenly appeared in the hallway and stopped the moment she noticed it. Her eyes widened ever so slightly before she quickly lowered her gaze. Adrian noticed her reaction. "How long?" he asked without looking away from Ethan. Mrs. Graves answered softly. "He has not accepted anything from a new nanny in almost a year, sir." Adrian returned his attention to Claire. "What exactly did you do?" Claire almost smiled. "Nothing extraordinary. I introduced myself. I admired his telescope. I folded a piece of paper." Adrian looked back toward Ethan. "Is that true?" The little boy remained silent for several seconds. Claire did not interrupt. Neither did Adrian. Finally, Ethan gave the smallest nod. It was barely noticeable, yet the entire atmosphere shifted. Mrs. Graves quietly covered her surprise with a composed expression. Adrian's shoulders relaxed by an inch, though only someone watching carefully would have recognized the change. He stepped into the room for the first time. Ethan instinctively looked toward his father, then back at the paper crane. Adrian crouched to his son's eye level. "Did you like it?" he asked gently. Ethan hesitated before whispering a single word. "Bird." Adrian's eyes softened with something almost impossible to recognize at first glance. Relief. He looked toward Claire again. "Every caregiver before you believed talking more would solve everything." Claire answered quietly. "Sometimes children are waiting for someone who is willing to listen to silence first." Another long pause followed. Adrian stood, slipping one hand into his pocket as he considered her words. "You have been here less than 1 hour," he said. "Most people spend weeks trying to impress me." Claire shook her head. "I was never trying to impress you." "Then who?" She looked toward Ethan, who was now carefully placing the little paper bird beside his favorite book about the stars. "Him." Adrian followed her gaze. For the first time in many months, his son had placed something new among the few possessions he truly treasured. It was only folded paper, yet somehow it carried more meaning than any expensive toy in the room. Adrian walked toward the doorway before stopping beside Claire. "Dinner is at 6, he said calmly. "Do not be late." He took one more step before adding without turning around, "And tomorrow morning, you will continue caring for Ethan." As the door quietly closed behind him, Claire released a slow breath she had not realized she had been holding. Across the room, Ethan carefully picked up the paper crane once more, and for the first time since she had arrived, the corners of his mouth lifted into the faintest hint of a smile. The next morning the mansion awakened with the same quiet precision as a luxury hotel, yet Claire noticed something unusual almost immediately. No one rushed through the hallways. Every employee moved calmly, speaking in low voices as though protecting the silence itself. Fresh sunlight poured through the towering windows, warming the marble floors with soft golden reflections. The scent of fresh coffee drifted from the kitchen while somewhere outside a gardener trimmed the rose hedges with slow, measured care. Everything looked peaceful, but beneath that perfect order Claire sensed an invisible tension, the kind that came from people constantly watching the mood of the house. Mrs. Graves met her outside the dining room carrying a small tray. "Ethan usually refuses breakfast," she explained. "Some mornings he does not leave his room until noon." Claire looked at the neatly arranged pancakes topped with sliced strawberries and smiled. "Then maybe breakfast needs to visit him instead." Mrs. Graves studied her for a moment before giving the smallest nod. "You may try." Carrying the tray upstairs, Claire paused outside Ethan's bedroom and knocked gently. "Good morning. I brought company." There was no response. She waited several seconds before quietly opening the door. Ethan sat beside the window, his constellation book open across his lap. The paper crane rested beside him exactly where he had left it the previous afternoon. He glanced toward the breakfast tray before returning his attention to the pages. Claire entered without speaking. Instead of placing the tray on the table, she sat cross-legged on the carpet again, balancing the plate on the floor between them. "When I was 6, she said casually, "I thought pancakes tasted better when they were cut into little stars." Ethan peeked at her from the corner of his eye. Claire picked up a butter knife and carefully trimmed one pancake into the shape of a crooked 5-pointed star. It was far from perfect, and she laughed softly at her own attempt. "That one looks more like Texas than a star." For the first time, Ethan's lips twitched ever so slightly. It was almost invisible, but Claire caught it. Without saying a word, she placed the plate within his reach and began reading the names of constellations from his book instead of asking him to eat. Orion, Cassiopeia, Pegasus. As she reached the page showing the North Star, Ethan quietly reached for the fork. He took one careful bite while pretending not to notice that Claire had seen him. By the time she finished reading the next page, half the breakfast had disappeared. Downstairs, Mrs. Graves stood frozen beside the dining room entrance after receiving a quiet report from another staff member who had passed Ethan's room moments earlier. "He is eating," the young housekeeper whispered in disbelief. Mrs. Graves slowly looked toward the second floor. "He never eats with someone he does not trust." Unknown to Claire, another pair of eyes had also noticed. Adrian stood inside his home office, where floor-to-ceiling security monitors displayed discrete camera views from the common areas of the estate. One screen showed Ethan's bedroom doorway. There was no sound, only images. Adrian watched as Claire sat comfortably on the floor instead of choosing the elegant chair beside the window. He watched her turn each page of the book while Ethan gradually moved closer without realizing it. She never reached for him, never instructed him, never filled every quiet moment with conversation. She simply made the room feel less empty. Adrian leaned back slowly, unable to explain why this ordinary scene held his attention longer than financial reports waiting across his mahogany desk. His assistant quietly entered carrying several folders before stopping beside him. "Your meeting begins in 10 minutes, sir." Adrian did not immediately answer. His eyes remained on the monitor where Ethan had just picked up the little paper crane again before carefully placing it beside Claire's sleeve as if saving a seat for it. After a thoughtful pause, Adrian finally spoke. "Cancel the first meeting." His assistant looked surprised. "Sir." Adrian's expression remained unreadable. "Reschedule it for this afternoon." As the office fell silent again, he continued watching the monitor for another long moment, realizing that for the first time in many months, his son no longer looked like a child waiting for someone to leave. 3 days passed, and the rhythm of the mansion began to change in ways that no one had expected. Ethan no longer spent every waking hour hidden inside his room. He still spoke very little, but he followed Claire into the library each morning, carrying his constellation book under one arm and the little paper crane in his pocket as though it were something precious. Together they built small cardboard planets, counted birds through the garden windows, and read stories without rushing through a single page. Claire quickly discovered that Ethan noticed everything. He could identify nearly every constellation in the northern sky, remembered the names of every gardener on the estate, and always knew exactly when rain would arrive by watching the clouds drift across the hills. Yet there was one thing she could never understand. Every afternoon, precisely at 3 o'clock, Ethan would quietly close whatever book he was reading, curl into the corner beside the window, and wrap both arms tightly around himself. His breathing became shallow. His shoulders stiffened. His cheerful curiosity disappeared as though someone had quietly turned off a light inside him. The first 2 afternoons Claire simply stayed nearby without interrupting him. On the third day she sat beside the window and began sketching stars on a blank sheet of paper. Ethan watched silently before speaking only 4 words. "Do not make loud noises." Claire lowered her pencil. "Do loud noises scare you?" He nodded almost invisibly. "Thunder?" she asked gently. Ethan shook his head. "Fireworks." Another small shake. He stared out the window, his voice becoming almost too soft to hear. "Popping sounds." Claire did not ask another question. She only folded the paper into another tiny crane and placed it beside him. A few minutes later Mrs. Graves entered quietly to announce that afternoon tea was ready downstairs. When she noticed Ethan sitting peacefully instead of trembling beneath his blanket fort, she smiled with visible relief. As Ethan wandered toward the bookshelf searching for another astronomy guide, Claire remained behind. "May I ask you something?" she said softly. Mrs. Graves looked toward the hallway to be certain Ethan could not hear. "Of course." Claire hesitated before speaking. Every day at the same time something changes. He becomes frightened, but not because of storms or being alone. He mentioned loud popping sounds. Mrs. Graves' expression slowly faded. For several moments she simply looked down at the polished hardwood floor. "He has always been sensitive," she answered carefully. Claire recognized the answer was incomplete. She did not press her. "Children usually connect fear to memories," she said gently. "Whatever happened, he still feels it." Mrs. Graves finally lifted her eyes. There was sadness there, mixed with years of quiet loyalty. "His mother loved music," she whispered. Every afternoon at 3, she played piano in the sunroom while Ethan sat beside her drawing stars. After she passed away, the house became different. She stopped herself before saying more. Since then, sudden noises remind him that peaceful afternoons do not always stay peaceful. Claire's heart tightened. She understood now that Ethan was not simply grieving the loss of someone he loved. He was grieving the loss of safety itself. Later that evening Claire found the old piano exactly where Mrs. Graves had described. Dust lightly covered the polished wood, but the keys remained perfectly cared for. She sat quietly on the bench and pressed a single gentle note. Its warm sound floated through the hallway like a memory returning home. Upstairs, Ethan froze in the middle of placing books back onto his shelf. Instead of fear crossing his face, something softer appeared. Curiosity. Slowly he followed the music until he reached the doorway of the sunroom. Claire noticed him standing there but continued playing the simple lullaby her grandmother had taught her years before. She was far from a professional pianist, yet each gentle melody filled the mansion with warmth that had been missing for far too long. Ethan walked inside, without speaking. He climbed onto the bench beside her and rested his small hand against the polished piano, closing his eyes as though trying to remember a feeling he thought had disappeared forever. Neither of them noticed Adrian standing quietly in the hallway outside the room, listening as music echoed through a home that had almost forgotten what comfort sounded like. The melody lingered in the air long after Claire lifted her fingers from the piano keys. Ethan remained seated beside her, his small hand still resting on the polished wood as though he feared the music might disappear if he let go. The afternoon sunlight streamed through the tall windows, painting long golden lines across the floor, and for a brief moment the mansion felt less like a carefully guarded estate and more like the family home it had once been. Claire smiled gently without breaking the silence. She had learned that Ethan trusted quiet moments more than endless conversation. "Did your mother play this piano often?" she asked softly. Ethan nodded. "Every day." His voice was barely above a whisper. "She said music makes houses breathe." Claire felt a lump rise in her throat. She looked around the elegant room, imagining laughter that had long since faded from its walls. "She sounds like someone who loved this home very much." Ethan traced one finger across the edge of the piano. After she was gone, nobody played anymore. Before Claire could answer, she sensed someone standing nearby. She turned slowly and found Adrian leaning against the doorway. His expression remained composed, but there was something different in his eyes. They were no longer studying Claire with suspicion. Instead, they were fixed on his son. Ethan had not spoken that many words in a single conversation for months. Adrian stepped into the room without interrupting the peaceful atmosphere. "I remember that song," he said quietly. Ethan looked toward his father. "Mom liked it." Adrian nodded once. "She did." For a few seconds, none of them spoke. The silence carried memories that did not need explaining. Claire noticed Adrian's gaze drift across the piano before settling on a framed photograph sitting quietly. In the corner of the room, it showed a smiling woman sitting at this very instrument while a much younger Ethan rested happily beside her. Adrian walked over and carefully adjusted the frame that had become slightly crooked with time. It was such a small gesture, yet Claire realized it was the first glimpse she had seen of the man beneath the carefully controlled exterior. He was not standing before a business empire now. He was standing beside the memory of someone he still missed every day. Ethan quietly slipped off the piano bench and walked to his father. Without saying a word, he reached for Adrian's hand. Claire held her breath, uncertain what would happen next. Adrian looked down with visible surprise before gently closing his large hand around his son's much smaller one. The simple gesture seemed almost unfamiliar, as though both father and son were remembering something they had not practiced in a long time. Ethan looked up. "Will you stay for dinner tonight?" Adrian hesitated. Claire noticed the question had caught him completely off guard. Mrs. Graves had once mentioned that Adrian often worked through the evening, returning long after Ethan had gone to bed. The little boy waited patiently without repeating himself. Finally, Adrian answered, "Yes." Ethan's face brightened with quiet satisfaction before he walked back toward the bookshelf, hugging the paper crane in one hand. Adrian watched him disappear down the hallway before turning toward Claire. "Mrs. Graves informed me that Ethan has eaten every meal since your arrival," he said. Claire smiled modestly. "He did the hard part. I only kept him company." Adrian studied her for a moment. "You continue giving him credit for changes everyone else attributes to you." "Because children know how to heal," Claire replied softly. "Sometimes they only need someone willing to wait while they find their way back." Adrian lowered his eyes briefly, reflecting on her words. "Patience has never been my strongest quality," Claire answered with a gentle smile. "It is becoming one." For the first time since they had met, the corners of Adrian's mouth lifted ever so slightly. It was not a full smile, only the faintest hint of one, but it transformed his entire expression. It vanished almost as quickly as it appeared, yet Claire had seen it. As Adrian quietly left the sunroom to prepare for the evening, he paused outside the doorway and glanced back one final time. Claire was helping Ethan fold another paper crane, while the old piano reflected the warm light of the setting sun. In that peaceful scene, Adrian realized something he had refused to believe for far too long. The greatest change inside his home had not come from expensive security, careful planning, or absolute control. It had begun with a young nanny who never tried to conquer silence, only to share it. The following week settled into a gentle routine that slowly transformed every corner of the estate. Morning walks through the gardens became Ethan's favorite part of the day. He no longer kept his eyes fixed on the ground. Instead, he pointed excitedly at butterflies resting on white roses, counted squirrels racing across the old oak branches, and reminded Claire which flowers would bloom next because the gardeners had taught him their names. Even the household staff smiled more often. They no longer whispered only out of caution. They whispered out of amazement. The little boy who had once hidden behind locked doors was beginning to explore the world again. One crisp Saturday afternoon, Claire spread a blanket beneath the largest oak tree on the property and unpacked colored pencils, sketchbooks, and a small telescope. Ethan immediately dropped onto the blanket beside her and opened his astronomy guide. "Can we draw the moon today?" he asked. Claire laughed softly. Only if we promise not to argue with its craters. Ethan looked puzzled for a second before smiling. The moon always wins. They spent nearly an hour sketching stars and clouds, while a gentle breeze carried the scent of lavender across the lawn. Not far away, two members of the security team stood watch from a respectful distance, careful never to interrupt Ethan's peaceful afternoon. Claire had grown accustomed to their quiet presence. She understood that protecting the family was part of their responsibility, yet they had also learned something. Over the past several days, whenever Claire was with Ethan, the child seemed lighter, calmer, and happier than anyone had seen in years. As the afternoon sun drifted lower, Ethan suddenly looked toward the mansion. "Dad is home early." Claire followed his gaze. Adrian had just stepped out onto the stone terrace after returning from the city. Instead of walking directly inside as he usually did, he stopped for a moment, watching the two of them from across the garden. Ethan immediately stood and waved with genuine excitement. "Dad!" Adrian raised his hand in return before making his way toward them at an unhurried pace. Claire noticed that he had removed his suit jacket, carrying it over one shoulder instead of wearing it. For the first time, he looked less like an untouchable businessman and more like an ordinary father coming home after a long day. Ethan proudly held up his drawing. "Look, Claire says the moon does not have to be perfect to be beautiful." Adrian accepted the paper carefully. The drawing was simple, with uneven circles and crooked stars, but Ethan had signed his name in large, confident letters across the bottom. Adrian studied it longer than anyone would expect. "I think Claire is right," he said quietly. Ethan grinned before running toward the nearby bird fountain, hoping to spot another robin. Adrian remained beside the blanket, still holding the drawing. "He signs his artwork now," he observed. Claire looked toward Ethan with a warm smile. "Children sign things when they are proud of them." Adrian nodded thoughtfully. He stopped doing that after his mother passed away. Neither of them spoke for several moments. The peaceful silence between them no longer felt uncomfortable, felt familiar. Then Adrian noticed another sheet of paper lying beside Claire's sketchbook. It was not a drawing of the moon. It was a rough sketch of the mansion itself, surrounded by gardens and sunlight. In one upstairs window, she had carefully drawn a tiny paper crane resting on the windowsill. Adrian looked at the picture before quietly asking, "Is that how you see this place?" Claire answered honestly, "Not exactly." He looked at her curiously. "It is how I think it could feel." Adrian lowered his eyes to the drawing again. Before he could respond, one of his senior staff members approached discreetly across the lawn and stopped several feet away. "Sir," he said respectfully, "there is an unexpected visitor requesting a private meeting. He insists it cannot wait." Adrian's expression immediately became more serious, though his voice remained calm. "Tell him I will meet him in the library." As the staff member walked away, Adrian looked once more toward Ethan, who was laughing quietly while watching two birds splash in the fountain. Then his eyes returned to Claire. "Please stay with him until I return." There was something different in the way he spoke those words. It was no longer simply an instruction from an employer. It sounded much closer to trust. Claire watched Ethan carefully as the afternoon settled into the calm rhythm they had come to treasure. After another hour in the garden, they wandered back inside carrying the telescope and sketchbooks together. The mansion felt unusually peaceful, with warm sunlight stretching across the marble floors and the quiet aroma of fresh bread drifting from the kitchen. Ethan stopped beside the grand staircase and looked toward Claire with an expression she had not seen before. It was not sadness or uncertainty. It was anticipation. "Can we have dinner together tonight?" he asked softly. Claire smiled. "Your father promised, remember?" Ethan nodded, but there was hesitation behind his eyes. Sometimes work changes his plans. Claire gently rested a hand on his shoulder. "Then we will wait for him together." Ethan accepted the answer with a small smile before heading upstairs to wash his hands. Meanwhile, inside the library, Adrian sat across from an unexpected visitor. The conversation remained quiet, respectful, and brief. When the meeting finally ended, the visitor rose, shook Adrian's hand, and left through the front entrance. Adrian remained alone for several moments, looking through the tall windows toward the gardens where Ethan had been laughing only an hour earlier. His thoughts drifted unexpectedly to the sound of piano music, paper cranes, and simple conversations about stars. He realized he had spent years protecting his family by building stronger walls, yet somehow Claire had accomplished more by opening one small door. A gentle knock interrupted his thoughts. Mrs. Graves stepped inside. "Dinner will be ready in 15 minutes. Adrian nodded before asking a question that surprised even himself. "Has Ethan smiled today?" Mrs. Graves answered without hesitation. "Many times, sir." She paused before adding, "The staff has noticed something else as well." Adrian looked up. "He no longer asks when Claire is leaving." The room fell silent. Adrian understood exactly what those words meant. For the first time since losing his mother, Ethan had stopped expecting the people he cared about to disappear. Upstairs, Claire found Ethan carefully arranging 3 place settings on a small table in the family dining room. He counted each fork twice to be certain everything was perfect. "Dad always sits there," he explained, pointing toward the chair at the head of the table. Then he surprised Claire by placing another setting beside his own instead of across from him. "That one is yours." Claire looked at the little arrangement with quiet gratitude. "Are you sure?" Ethan nodded confidently. "Families sit close." Before Claire could answer, Adrian entered the room. He stopped just inside the doorway after noticing the table. 3 plates, 3 glasses, 3 folded napkins. Ethan looked up nervously, suddenly unsure whether he had overstepped. "I thought," he began quietly before losing confidence. Adrian walked forward without a word. He looked first at his son's hopeful face, then at Claire, who remained respectfully silent, allowing Ethan to speak for himself. Finally, Adrian pulled out the chair beside Ethan and looked toward Claire. "Please," he said warmly, "join us." It was the first invitation he had ever extended to her that carried no trace of formality. Dinner unfolded more naturally than anyone could have predicted. Ethan spoke about constellations, birds, and his newest paper crane. Claire listened with genuine interest, occasionally asking simple questions that encouraged him to tell another story. Adrian found himself listening more than speaking, quietly absorbing each sentence his son offered. At one point, Ethan laughed so suddenly at one of Claire's playful observations about crooked pancakes that he accidentally knocked his spoon onto the table. The sound echoed softly through the dining room. For an instant, Ethan froze, his old fear threatening to return. Without thinking, Adrian calmly picked up the spoon, placed it back beside his son's plate, and smiled gently. "It happens." Ethan looked into his father's eyes, searching for disappointment that never came. A slow smile returned to his face, and dinner continued as though nothing had happened. Watching the exchange, Claire realized that the greatest change was no longer happening inside Ethan alone. Father and son were quietly learning each other again, one ordinary moment at a time. As the evening sun faded beyond the windows, the mansion no longer felt defined by silence. It was beginning to fill with something far more powerful than perfect order. It was beginning to sound like home. The weeks that followed unfolded with a quiet kind of wonder that no one inside the mansion could have predicted. The grand halls that had once echoed with careful footsteps and whispered conversations slowly welcomed new sounds. Ethan's laughter drifted through the library as he challenged Claire to guess the names of constellations before he could point them out. The old piano no longer gathered dust because someone played it almost every afternoon. Fresh flowers appeared on the dining table without special occasions because Mrs. Graves said the house finally looked as though it deserved them. Even the staff carried themselves differently. They smiled more often, greeted one another more warmly, and no longer measured every moment by silence. One cool autumn evening, the sky above the estate shimmered with hundreds of bright stars. Claire carried a thick blanket onto the rooftop terrace while Ethan hurried behind her with his telescope and constellation guide tucked under his arm. Adrian joined them a few minutes later, dressed simply in a dark sweater instead of the formal clothing he usually wore at the end of the day. Ethan carefully adjusted the telescope until it pointed toward the brightest cluster overhead. "There," he said proudly. "That is Orion." Adrian leaned down beside his son. "Show me." Together they looked through the telescope, father and son sharing the same quiet excitement. Claire stepped back, allowing the moment to belong entirely to them. She wrapped the blanket around her shoulders and watched as Ethan explained each constellation with growing confidence. His voice carried across the terrace with the enthusiasm of a child who no longer questioned whether anyone wanted to hear him speak. After several minutes, Ethan looked toward Claire. "Come see this one." She smiled and joined them. The three of them stood shoulder to shoulder beneath the clear night sky while countless stars stretched endlessly above. Ethan pointed upward. "Mom used to say people feel small when they look at the stars. But she said that is a good thing because it reminds us that kindness can be bigger than we think." Adrian remained silent for a long moment. Then he quietly answered, "She was right." The words lingered in the cool evening air. Claire glanced toward him and noticed that his expression no longer carried the constant weight she had seen on her first day. There was still sadness. Some losses never disappeared. But beside that sadness now lived something else. Hope. Ethan reached into his jacket pocket and carefully removed the very first paper crane Claire had folded on the afternoon they met. Although its edges had softened from being carried everywhere, he had protected it with extraordinary care. "I want to keep this forever," he said. Claire smiled gently. "Why?" Ethan looked from the tiny paper bird to his father before answering. "Because everything changed after that." Adrian accepted the little crane into his hands with surprising gentleness. He studied its simple folds before returning it to Ethan. "Sometimes," he said quietly, "the smallest things change the most." Claire felt the cool breeze brush across the terrace as the estate lights glowed warmly behind them. She remembered arriving through those enormous gates believing she had accepted nothing more than another nanny position. Instead, she had stepped into a family frozen by grief, where silence had become easier than healing. Yet healing had never arrived through grand speeches or impossible promises. It had arrived one patient conversation, one shared meal, one quiet melody, and one folded piece of paper at a time. As the evening grew darker, Ethan slipped one hand into his father's and reached for Claire's with the other. Neither adult spoke. No words could improve the simple truth unfolding beneath the stars. The mansion that had once felt like a fortress no longer seemed guarded by its towering gates or endless walls. It was protected by something far stronger. Trust had returned. Laughter had returned. A father had found his way back to his son. And a young nanny who had entered as a stranger had reminded an entire household that the strongest homes are never built with stone alone. They are built every single day through patience, compassion, and the quiet courage to stay when someone needs you most. For the first time in years, the lights shining through the windows did not simply illuminate a magnificent estate. They illuminated a family that had finally found its way home.